This video was made possible by my patrons, Joshua Bartlett, Scorch88, Drew Cavallo, Thomas Frost, James Schubach, Douglas Smith, Capitalism is Good, Pipsqueak, Michael, Valerie Calkins, Victor Cage, and Snizzypoo. Thank you so much to all of you. Hello everyone, this is My 2 Cents. If you haven't watched part 1 of this debunking, the link is in the description, so be sure to watch that video first. Assuming you've already watched the first part, let's get right into it.
The fourth argument is that there is a large difference, and therefore disanalogy, between the robbery and entering into a wage contract. The first difference is that in the robbery, the consequence of death is immediate and directly as a result of the robber's actions, while in the case of wage labour, the consequence of death is distant and an indirect result of the action of the capitalist, who did not purposely choose that the wage labourer dies, but instead reproduced a social system whose consequences are workers dying from starvation or illness. This first difference is not particularly problematic, since the socialist can argue that the threat of death in the robbery and the threat of death to the wage labourer are similar, since in both examples the end result, death, is the same. Thus, while they are different types of threats of death, they are nonetheless both threats of death, and it is this shared feature that ensures that in both instances one lacks meaningful alternatives.
This is nonsense. The capitalist is not threatening the laborer with death in any sense, directly or indirectly. As I said before, it is nature itself that renders it such that if one does not eat, one dies, and if someone doesn't work, there's no food to eat. In the case of wage labor, the business owner is simply saying, if you want my money, you'll have to provide a service for me in return. Workers are free to either accept this or reject this, seeking employment from the employer who makes the best offer. It is in fact socialism that is analogous to robbery. In the case of robbery, the robber holds a gun to the head of a person and says, "Give me your stuff or I'll kill you." Under socialism, the state holds guns to its hardworking citizens and says, "Give us your stuff so we can have it ourselves and give it to people who didn't work for it, or we'll throw you in prison, or maybe even kill you." Socialism is simply robbery on a grand scale.
The second difference is related to the first difference, but is not identical with it. It is that in the instance of the robbery, one cannot simply walk away, since doing so will result in being killed immediately, while a worker can leave a particular workplace whenever they want and seek employment elsewhere. The robbery is an instance of immediate and almost certain death, while the worker who is unable to find employment, and so falls into extreme poverty, experiences the more distant and less likely possibility of death by starvation or illness, since they may survive off charity, the mutual aid of friends and family, and in many modern capitalist nations, the welfare state.
This isn't really his point, but just as an aside, I don't have a problem with charity, so long as it is voluntary. If you want to take money that you've earned and give it to someone in need, no strings attached, then good for you. In fact, the poor are more likely to be grateful in such a circumstance, since they see that the gift given was voluntary. However, the welfare state, in which the poor man is told that he is entitled to what he is given, is an example of wealth being redistributed to people who did not earn the wealth, whether the people who did earn it like it or not. This is theft. I know that Marxists don't like referring to welfare as socialism because it doesn't necessarily involve communal ownership of the means of production, but mass welfare states and full-blown socialism still suffer from the same fundamental problem, which is the assertion that people are entitled to things simply for existing.
The point being that while the worker's choices are limited by the possibility of poverty and starvation, they are not as greatly limited as the victim in the robbery. Moreover, the victim in the robbery is more certain that if they do not make their own meaningful choice they will die than the wage labourer is. It is more likely that the wage labourer will find another job, become self-employed, or survive on the welfare of others or the state.
Which means surviving on the fruits of other people's labour.
Than it is that the victim in the robbery will escape. As a result, it is questionable whether or not workers experience the same lack of meaningful consent as the victim in the robbery. The argument is that while the constraints in the robbery are sufficient to negate the possibility of meaningful consent, since one is certain of the consequence of not complying with the robber, the constraints faced by wage labourers are not sufficient to negate the possibility of meaningful consent, since one is less certain of the consequences of not entering into a wage contract. The analogy is therefore not as conclusive as the socialist would hope.
Well, it's an understatement to say it's not conclusive. It's not analogous at all. Business owners do not in any way cause people to starve if they choose not to work. Once again, nature does that.
The socialist can, however, respond to this argument. In the robbery example, it is not entirely certain that one will be killed, since the robber could be a bad shot, shoot to wound, or one could be saved by modern medicine. What is certain, though, is that one will suffer if one does not comply with the demands of the robber. The same is true of the wage labourer. Even if the wage labourer cannot be certain that they will die or experience extreme poverty, they will nonetheless significantly suffer if they do not enter into a wage contract. Therefore, their choice is between working for a capitalist, almost certainly suffering with the very strong possibility of experiencing poverty, and the less strong possibility, death via starvation or illness. Thus, while their choice is not as absolute as work for a boss or die, it is nonetheless a decision in which one lacks meaningful options due to the high probability of poverty and therefore significant suffering.
I'm probably sounding like a broken record, but he still hasn't addressed the fact that it's not the business owner's fault what happens to the person if that person chooses not to work. You don't have to like the fact that for wealth to exist, people have to work, but that doesn't make it untrue.
The fifth argument is that if wage labour is not voluntary, then socialism is not voluntary either. This is due to the belief that under socialism one's choices work for the collective in order to receive the essentials of life or experience poverty and die. Even if people under socialism receive considerable welfare, in order for society to function and provide said welfare, some people are going to have to work.
Bingo!
The problem with this argument is that socialists are not claiming that they are exempt from their criticism. It is the capitalist who claims exemption when they argue that workers voluntarily enter into wage labour and that an anarcho-capitalist society is an entirely voluntary one. It is these two claims that the socialist is responding to. To argue that the socialist's argument applies to socialism does not refute the socialist's argument, and thus any capitalist who argues this must immediately cease to argue that wage labour is voluntary, and therefore justified, and that anarcho-capitalism is an entirely voluntary society.
As I believe I've thoroughly shown at this point, you would only have a case if it were in fact the business owner's fault that people starve to death if they don't work. But again, that's nature's fault, not the business owner's. What you do with your time is your business, and heck, if you want to starve, be my guest. But you are not entitled to the fruits of my labor if you don't give me something in return.
Socialists, in comparison to capitalists, argue that socialism maximizes autonomy more than capitalism, not that socialism is a society in which individuals are completely autonomous. Or to put it differently, socialism is a society that is more voluntary than capitalism, not a society that is completely voluntary. It is the capitalists who are the utopians, who believe that their society would be entirely free, and not the socialists who have the far more humble claim that their society is freer than a capitalist society.
Oh yeah, totally. A society where you don't get to keep the fruits of your own labor, and your neighbor who only worked 1 hour while you worked 10 still goes home with the same amount of goods and services as you do. A society where the doctor who spent years in medical school is no better off than the garbage man who didn't go to school at all. A society where everyone is free to be equally poor. Socialism should only sound good to you if you're a lazy piece of human garbage. Well, we're almost there, but there's still enough left for one more segment. Check back next week for the final segment of this debunking. As a parting thought that we'll get into next time, I want everyone to think about the difference between freedom and means. For example, I have the freedom to bench press 500 tons, if I want to. However, I do not have the means, which in that case would be the physical strength to do so. However, I think it's pretty obvious that it would be ludicrous for me to assert that I have some kind of fundamental right to having the physical strength to accomplish any feat I want to. In the same way, just because you lack the ability to survive without eating, and you can't eat without food, which does require work, does it follow that you're somehow entitled to the means to survive without working? Think about it. That's my 2 cents. Take it for what it's worth. Thanks everyone for watching. If you liked this video, please hit like and subscribe. You can also hit the bell to ensure you're notified every time I upload a new video. This video was made possible by my patrons. If anyone else would like to donate and help ensure that I have the time and resources to keep putting out content, for just $1 a month on Patreon or Maker Support, you'll receive your name listed in the end credits and the link to one of your social media platforms listed in the description. You can also support the channel by purchasing my 2 cents merchandise or checking out my Amazon affiliate links. To follow me on Twitter, Minds.com, BitChute, WordPress, Gab, or iTunes, check out the links in the description. Uploads are every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, so stay tuned for more videos.